The war cry pierced the Texas dawn like a blade through silk. Jack Sullivan pressed his back against the adobe wall of Mission San Rafael, his Colt .45 steady in his hand as 50 Comanche warriors surrounded the small building. Their painted faces gleamed with fury in the early light, and at their head rode a man Jack had hoped never to see again, Joseph Henderson, known to his people as Iron Wolf, the war chief who was supposed to be dead. "You have something that belongs to me, Sullivan," Iron Wolf's voice carried across the courtyard, speaking perfect English despite the traditional war paint streaking his weathered face. 5 daughters, 5 pieces of my heart. Inside the mission, Jack could hear them, Mary's steady voice calming her younger sisters, Ruth's defiant whisper that they should fight, Grace's quiet prayers, Hope's angry tears, and Faith's innocent question about why their father looked so different. These weren't just 5 women he'd won in a poker game 3 months ago. They'd become his family, his purpose, his redemption. And now their Comanche father had come to reclaim them, threatening to tear apart the only good thing Jack had ever built. This isn't where our story begins, but it's where 5 lives hung in the balance, where honor would clash with love, and where a lonely cowboy would discover that sometimes winning means learning how to let go. Before we jump back to see how we got here, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Jack Sullivan rode into Copper Ridge with nothing but $27, a tired horse named Bandit, and a reputation that preceded him like smoke before fire. He'd been drifting for 2 years since mustering out of the cavalry, picking up work where he could find it, sleeping under stars more often than roofs. The town looked like a dozen others he'd passed through, weathered buildings lining a dusty main street, the Silver Dollar Saloon promising cheap whiskey and expensive mistakes, and people who minded their own business as long as you minded yours. Jack had learned the hard way that home wasn't a place you could buy with money or claim with papers. It was something that found you when you least expected it, usually when you'd given up looking. At 32, he'd given up looking for most things: love, belonging, a future that stretched beyond the next card game or the next town. He'd been running since his discharge, not from the law or enemies, but from the hollow echo of his own footsteps in empty rooms and the weight of sleeping alone under an indifferent sky. The cavalry had been his family for 8 years, his brothers in arms, the closest thing to kinship he'd known since his parents died of fever when he was 14. But the Indian wars were winding down, and there was no place for a scout in a peacetime army. They'd given him his papers, his back pay, and a handshake that felt like goodbye to everything he'd ever belonged to. Since then, he'd been a ghost haunting the borderlands between his past and a future he couldn't quite imagine. Copper Ridge sat at the edge of 2 worlds, the settled lands where white farmers and ranchers tried to tame the earth, and the wild country where free Comanche bands still rode the ancient paths their grandfathers had carved into the landscape. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to, or find himself if he was brave enough to look. Jack wasn't sure which one he was after, but he figured the town was as good a place as any to rest Bandit and resupply before moving on to wherever the road led next. The afternoon heat shimmered off the main street as Jack guided Bandit toward the livery stable. He'd learned to read a town quickly during his wandering years, and Copper Ridge felt tense in a way that had nothing to do with the summer sun. People moved with purpose but kept their heads down. Conversations stopped when strangers passed, and more than one hand rested casually near a gun belt. This was a community holding its breath, waiting for something to break. That evening, Jack found himself in the Silver Dollar Saloon, nursing a whiskey and watching a poker game that had been running since noon. The players included Samuel Morrison, the saloon owner whose gold teeth gleamed when he smiled, Deputy Tom Bradley, who was supposed to be keeping the peace but seemed more interested in keeping his cards close, and 3 local ranchers whose luck had been running cold all day. Morrison controlled the table with the easy confidence of a man who owned the house, literally and figuratively, and his pile of chips suggested the house always won in the end. The conversation drifted from cattle prices to the weather to the Henderson sisters, who apparently owed Morrison a considerable sum of money. Jack found himself listening despite his better judgment as Morrison complained about the 5 women who'd inherited a failing ranch and couldn't make good on their mother's debts. The way Morrison talked about them, like livestock that had become inconvenient, made something cold settle in Jack's stomach. He'd seen enough of the world to know what happened to women without protection or resources in places like Copper Ridge. When one of the ranchers folded and left the table, Morrison caught Jack's eye and gestured to the empty chair with the casualness of a spider inviting a fly into its web. Jack had been playing cards since he was old enough to hold them steady, and he could read Morrison's type from across the room, a man who mistook cunning for intelligence and cruelty for strength. Against his better judgment, Jack found himself walking to the table, his $27 suddenly feeling like either the beginning of something or the end of everything he had left. The game started friendly enough, with Morrison telling stories about the early days of Copper Ridge and the challenges of running a business on the frontier. He painted himself as a pillar of the community, a man who'd brought civilization to the wilderness through hard work and fair dealing. But Jack noticed how Morrison's eyes never quite met his when he spoke, and how the other players seemed more afraid than friendly. This was a man who collected debts and grudges with equal enthusiasm, and who never forgot either. As the night wore on and the stakes gradually climbed, Morrison began talking more freely about the Henderson sisters. Their mother had been a white woman who'd married a Comanche warrior before he was reportedly killed in a cavalry raid 3 years earlier. The 5 daughters had been trying to keep the ranch running ever since, but they lacked the money, the help, and apparently the business sense to make it work. Morrison held their notes for back taxes, supply debts, and loans that had come due with interest that seemed to compound every time he mentioned it. Jack found himself asking questions he hadn't planned to ask. How old were the sisters? Did they have anywhere else to go? What would happen to them if they couldn't pay? Morrison's answers painted a picture of 5 young women trapped between worlds, too Indian for the white community to fully accept, too white for the reservation, and too proud to simply disappear into the night. They were fighting to hold onto the only home they'd ever known, but they were fighting a battle they couldn't win against a man who held all the advantages. When Morrison suggested raising the stakes beyond what any of them could afford with cash alone, Jack should have walked away. He'd survived 2 years of drifting by knowing when to fold and when to run, and every instinct he'd developed screamed that this was one of those times. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But something about the casual way Morrison discussed the Henderson sisters' fate, like they were just another commodity to be traded or discarded, made Jack's cavalry training kick in. He'd spent 8 years protecting settlers from raids and raiders from reprisals, trying to keep the peace between peoples who often seemed determined to destroy each other. Maybe old habits died harder than he'd thought. Morrison's proposal was simple and monstrous in its simplicity. The Henderson sisters owed him $800 in various debts and fees that had accumulated over the years since their mother's death. If Jack could match that amount in the pot, his horse, his gear, his guns, and the $27 that represented everything he owned, Morrison would wager the entire debt. Win, and the sisters would be free of their obligations. Lose, and Jack would be walking away from Copper Ridge with nothing but the clothes on his back. But Morrison had one more twist, delivered with the smile of a man who enjoyed other people's discomfort. If Jack won, he wouldn't just be canceling the debt. According to the contracts Morrison held, Jack would be assuming ownership of the labor agreements the sisters had signed to secure their loans. Legally, morally, and practically, he would own 5 human beings who had never asked for his help and might not want his protection. Jack stared at his cards and felt the weight of a decision that would change everything. He could fold, finish his drink, and ride out of Copper Ridge in the morning with his conscience clear and his future unchanged. Or he could make a bet that might free 5 women from Morrison's control, even if it meant assuming a responsibility he'd never asked for and wasn't sure he could handle. The cards in his hand seemed to pulse with possibility and danger in equal measure. The final hand played out with the inevitability of a storm breaking over the plains. Jack's straight flush beat Morrison's full house by the narrowest of margins, and suddenly he found himself holding legal documents that made him responsible for 5 lives he'd never seen. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally a cold smile that suggested this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The other players drifted away like smoke, leaving Jack alone with his victory and the sinking realization that he'd just stepped into something far more complicated than a simple card game. Deputy Bradley made it clear that the contracts were legal and binding, backed by territorial law and Morrison's connections throughout the county. Jack could tear up the papers and walk away, but that would leave the Henderson sisters right back where they started, owing Morrison money they couldn't pay and facing consequences Jack didn't want to imagine. Or he could ride out to their ranch in the morning and try to explain to 5 strangers that their lives had just changed because of a poker game they'd never known was happening. As Jack walked back to his hotel room that night, the weight of the documents in his pocket felt heavier than any burden he'd carried during 8 years of cavalry service. He'd won 5 women in a card game, but he had no idea what that victory was going to cost him, or them, or the community that was already watching this strange new development with interest and suspicion. The road that had brought him to Copper Ridge had seemed like just another stretch of dirt and dust, but now it felt like the beginning of a journey he couldn't turn back from. Tomorrow he would ride out to the Henderson ranch and meet the 5 sisters whose fate had become entangled with his through the turn of cards and the machinations of a man who collected human misery like other people collected stamps. Jack had thought he was just drifting through another town, killing time until the next opportunity presented itself. Instead, he'd stumbled into a situation that would test everything he believed about honor, responsibility, and what it meant to be a man worth the space he took up in the world. The moon was high and bright as Jack finally fell asleep, and in his dreams he saw 5 faces he'd never met, but whose lives now rested in his weathered hands. He'd spent 2 years running from commitment connection, convinced that a man was safer when he traveled light and loved nothing he couldn't afford to lose. But some responsibilities couldn't be avoided, and some burdens were worth carrying, even when you didn't know where they might lead. By morning, Jack Sullivan would discover that winning could be more complicated than losing, that freedom sometimes looked like a different kind of chains, and that the hardest thing about saving someone else might be learning how to save yourself in the process. The Henderson sisters were waiting, whether they knew it or not, and Jack was about to find out if a lonely cowboy could become the kind of man 5 proud women might choose to trust with their lives and their future. The morning sun painted the Texas hills in shades of amber and gold as Jack Sullivan rode toward the Henderson ranch, the legal documents folded in his shirt pocket, feeling like they weighed more than his saddle. Bandits' hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air, and Jack found himself riding slower than usual, postponing the moment when he'd have to look 5 women in the eye and explain how their lives had become the stakes in a poker game they'd never agreed to play. The Henderson ranch appeared through a grove of mesquite trees like something from a half-remembered dream. The main house was built of adobe and weathered wood, its walls the color of dried earth, and its roof tiles bearing the scars of countless storms. A wide porch wrapped around the front, supported by posts that had been carved with intricate patterns that spoke of Mexican craftsmanship from an earlier era. The barn stood 100 yards away, its doors hanging slightly askew, and several corrals stretched between the buildings, most of them empty except for a few horses that watched Jack's approach with curious eyes. What struck Jack most about the place was how it felt both lived in and abandoned at the same time. Laundry hung on lines strung between the house and barn. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds along the porch, and smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray ribbon that spoke of breakfast being prepared. But the fences needed mending. Weeds grew tall in the vegetable garden, and there was an air of things barely held together through sheer determination and stubborn pride. As Jack dismounted and tied Bandit to the hitching post, he heard voices from inside the house. The sound carried through the morning air with the cadence of an argument that had been going on for some time, punctuated by the occasional sharp word and the scrape of chairs being pushed back from a table. Jack hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly unsure of everything about the situation. What did you say to 5 women whose fate you just won in a card game? How did you explain that their problems had become your problems without sounding like either a savior or a fool? The front door opened before Jack could knock, and he found himself face to face with a young woman whose dark eyes held the kind of wariness that came from dealing with too many disappointments and not enough pleasant surprises. She was perhaps 24, with long black hair braided down her back and wearing a simple blue dress that had been mended in several places but was spotlessly clean. Her face showed the heritage Jack had heard about in town: high cheekbones, an olive skin that spoke of her Comanche father, combined with the green eyes and delicate features inherited from her white mother. "You must be Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying a mix of resignation and defiance that suggested she'd been expecting this visit but wasn't particularly happy about it. "Morrison sent word that he'd lost our contracts to some drifter in a poker game. I'm Mary Henderson, and before you say whatever you came here to say, you should know that my sisters and I don't consider ourselves anybody's property, regardless of what papers you might be carrying." Jack removed his hat and held it awkwardly in his hands, feeling like a schoolboy called before the teacher, despite being nearly a decade older than the woman facing him. "Ma'am, I reckon we need to talk. All of us. This situation isn't what anybody would call normal, and I figure we ought to sort out where we all stand before anybody makes assumptions about anybody else." Mary studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions in the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied some test, because she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. "My sisters are in the kitchen," she said. "Fair warning, though. Ruth's got our father's temper. Hope's never met a fight she wouldn't pick, and Grace thinks everybody deserves the benefit of the doubt. Faith's the only one with any sense, and she's 16. The interior of the house was much like the exterior, well-maintained, but showing the signs of a family making do with less than they needed. The furniture was solid but mismatched. The walls were decorated with a mixture of Mexican religious artifacts and Comanche crafts that spoke of the blended heritage Mary had mentioned, and everything was scrupulously clean in the way that came from taking pride in what little you had. Jack could smell coffee and bacon from the kitchen, and his stomach reminded him that he'd been too nervous to eat breakfast at the hotel. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a large room with a massive stove that dominated one wall and a wooden table that could seat 8 people comfortably. 4 young women sat around that table now, and they all looked up when Mary led Jack through the doorway. The family resemblance was unmistakable, but each sister had her own distinct presence that Jack could feel even in the few seconds before anyone spoke. Ruth, who Jack guessed was the second eldest, had the same dark hair as Mary, but wore it loose around her shoulders, and her brown eyes held a spark of anger that seemed ready to ignite at any moment. She was perhaps 22, with her father's strong jaw and her mother's elegant hands, and she sat with her arms crossed in a way that suggested she was prepared to fight about whatever Jack had come to discuss. Grace, the middle sister, had softer features and a gentler manner, though Jack could see steel beneath her quiet demeanor. She was perhaps 20, with lighter hair than her sisters and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of her own thoughts. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she watched Jack with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was forming judgments, but keeping them to herself. Hope looked like trouble with a capital T at 18. She had her father's bold features and a way of sitting that suggested she was ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms, and her eyes held the kind of defiant spark that Jack had seen in young cavalry recruits who thought they could take on the world with nothing but courage and attitude. Faith, the youngest at 16, was still growing into her features, but Jack could see that she was going to be beautiful in a way that would cause problems for any man charged with protecting her. She had her mother's delicate bone structure combined with her father's intelligent eyes, and there was something about her that suggested she saw more and understood more than anyone gave her credit for. "Sisters," Mary said, taking her place at the head of the table, "this is Jack Sullivan. He's the man who won our contracts from Morrison last night." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, heavy with implications that nobody wanted to examine too closely. Ruth was the first to speak, her voice sharp with indignation. "Won us? What are we, horses at auction? I don't care what papers Morrison had drawn up. We're not property to be wagered and won by men who think they can play games with other people's lives." Jack held up his hands in a gesture that was part surrender and part plea for patience. "Ma'am, I understand your anger, and I respect it. If I could have handled this situation differently, I would have. But Morrison was going to collect on your debt one way or another, and from what I could tell, his plans for doing that weren't going to be pleasant for any of you." Hope leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity and suspicion. "So you're saying you saved us? Out of the goodness of your heart? Forgive me if I find that hard to believe. Men don't risk everything they own for strangers unless they expect something in return." Grace spoke for the first time, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the tension-filled room. "What exactly did you win, Mr. Sullivan? What do these contracts say we owe you?" Jack reached into his pocket and withdrew the documents Morrison had signed over to him, spreading them carefully on the table where all 5 sisters could see them. The papers were covered with legal language that boiled down to a simple and ugly truth. The Henderson sisters had signed away their labor and their property as collateral for loans that had grown beyond their ability to repay. "According to these papers," Jack said slowly, "you ladies agreed to work off your debt to Morrison through ranch labor, household services, and whatever other duties he deemed appropriate. The total amount owed is $800 plus interest and fees that seem to grow every month." Faith, who had been silent until now, looked up from the documents with eyes that held a wisdom beyond her 16 years. "Those contracts were signed when we were desperate," she said quietly. "Our mother was dying. We had no money for medicine or doctors, and Morrison offered to help in exchange for our promise to work off the debt. We didn't understand how the interest would compound, or how he could add fees for whatever he wanted." Mary's face was pale but determined as she met Jack's eyes across the table. "Morrison's been finding excuses to increase what we owe him every month. A late payment here, damaged goods there, extra fees for this and that. We've been working ourselves to death trying to pay him back, but the debt just keeps growing. At the rate we're going, we'll be working for him for the rest of our lives." Jack studied the 5 faces around the table, seeing pride and fear and anger and desperation in equal measure. These weren't helpless victims waiting for a man to rescue them. They were fighters who had been backed into a corner by circumstances beyond their control, and a predator who had taken advantage of their desperation. "Here's what I'm thinking," Jack said carefully, knowing that his next words would determine whether these women trusted him or threw him off their land. These contracts give me the legal right to your labor, but they don't give me the moral right to claim it. You didn't ask to be won in a poker game, and I didn't ask to become responsible for 5 lives I'd never met." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "So what are you proposing? That you tear up the contracts and ride away? Because that just puts us right back where we started with Morrison. Except now he'll be even angrier than before." Jack shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm proposing something different. You need protection from Morrison and help getting this ranch back on its feet. I need a place to belong and work that means something. Maybe we can help each other without anybody owning anybody else." Hope laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You want to play house with 5 women you don't know? What happens when you get bored or find something better? What happens when you decide we're more trouble than we're worth?" The question hit closer to home than Jack cared to admit. He'd spent 2 years running from commitment responsibility, convincing himself that a man was safer when he traveled light and loved nothing he couldn't afford to lose. But sitting in this kitchen, looking at 5 faces that held more courage and dignity than most men he'd known in the cavalry, Jack felt something shift inside him. "I can't make promises about the future," he said honestly. "I've been drifting for 2 years, and I don't know if I remember how to stay in one place or be the kind of man a family can depend on. But I know right from wrong, and I know that Morrison's plans for you ladies aren't right by any definition of the word." Grace leaned back in her chair, studying Jack with the kind of careful attention she might give to a horse she was thinking about buying. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Sullivan? Partnership? Employment? Charity?" Jack took a deep breath, knowing that he was about to step off a cliff into territory he'd never navigated before. "I'm offering to honor these contracts in a way Morrison never would have. You work the ranch, I provide protection and help with the heavy labor. We split the profits fairly, and when the $800 is paid off, you're free to make your own choices about your future." Mary's voice was quiet but firm. "And if we refuse? If we tell you to tear up those papers and leave us to handle Morrison ourselves?" Jack met her eyes steadily. "Then I'll do exactly that. But I'll also stay in town long enough to make sure Morrison understands that anybody who bothers you will have to deal with me first. These contracts might make me legally responsible for you, but they don't make you responsible for me." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of a clock on the kitchen wall and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. Jack could see the 5 sisters exchanging glances, communicating in the wordless way that families developed over years of shared struggle and mutual dependence. Finally, Faith spoke up, her young voice carrying a gravity that made everyone listen. "Mr. Sullivan, you say you've been drifting for 2 years. What makes you think you're ready to stop running now?" The question was simple and devastating in its directness. Jack found himself thinking about empty hotel rooms and cold camps under indifferent stars, about conversations with strangers who would forget his name before he'd ridden out of sight, about the hollow echo of his own footsteps, and the weight of sleeping alone. He thought about the cavalry brothers he'd lost, and the sense of purpose that had died with them, about 2 years of trying to fill the emptiness with movement and distance and the illusion that a man could outrun his own loneliness. "Maybe I'm not ready," Jack admitted. "Maybe I'll fail at this just like I failed at everything else since mustering out of the army. But I'm tired of running from things, and I'm tired of being alone. You ladies deserve better than what Morrison had planned for you, and maybe helping you get it will teach me how to be better than what I've been." Ruth studied his face for a long moment, then looked around the table at her sisters. "We need time to discuss this among ourselves," she said finally. "This is our home, our family, our decision. We'll give you an answer by tomorrow morning." Jack stood up from the table, understanding that the conversation was over for now. "That's fair," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll be staying at the hotel in town. If you need anything before tomorrow, send word and I'll come running." As he walked toward the door, Grace's voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan? What made you sit down at that poker table last night? What made you risk everything you owned for people you'd never met?" Jack paused in the doorway, considering the question. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it was hearing Morrison talk about you ladies like you were livestock. Maybe it was recognizing something in your situation that reminded me of times when I needed help and didn't get it. Or maybe I was just tired of being the kind of man who walks away when he should stand up." The ride back to town gave Jack plenty of time to think about what he'd gotten himself into. The Henderson sisters were proud, intelligent, and perfectly capable of taking care of themselves under normal circumstances. But Morrison had trapped them in a web of debt and legal obligation that turned their strength against them, and Jack had stepped into that web without fully understanding what it meant or what it would cost him. As Copper Ridge came into view, Jack found himself hoping that the 5 women would accept his offer, not because he thought they needed saving, but because he was beginning to suspect that they might be his salvation. For 2 years he'd been a ghost haunting the borderlands between his past and a future he couldn't imagine. Maybe it was time to stop haunting and start living, even if it meant taking on responsibilities he wasn't sure he could handle. The hotel room felt smaller and lonelier than it had the night before, and Jack found himself staring out the window toward the hills where the Henderson ranch waited in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow he would have his answer, and tomorrow he would discover whether a drifting cowboy could become the kind of man 5 proud women might choose to trust with their lives and their future. The cards had been dealt, the stakes had been set, and now all that remained was to see how the hand would play out. The knock on Jack's hotel room door came before dawn, soft but insistent enough to pull him from restless dreams, filled with 5 faces and questions he couldn't answer. He opened the door to find Faith Henderson standing in the dim hallway, her young face serious in the lamplight from the lobby below. She wore a simple brown dress and a shawl that had seen better years, and her dark eyes held a determination that seemed too old for her 16 years. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, glancing down the hallway to make sure they weren't overheard, "my sisters sent me to fetch you. We've made our decision, but there are things we need to discuss that can't wait for a more civilized hour." Jack grabbed his hat and gun belt, following Faith down the back stairs of the hotel and into the pre-dawn darkness of Copper Ridge's main street. Their footsteps echoed softly off the wooden boardwalks as they made their way to where 2 horses waited tied to the hitching post outside the general store. Faith swung up into her saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood, and they set off toward the ranch at a pace that suggested urgency without panic. "Your sisters reach a consensus?" Jack asked as they rode through the sleeping town, past darkened windows and empty streets that would soon be bustling with the business of another day. Faith was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful in the pale light that preceded sunrise. "Mary wants to trust you because she thinks you're different from Morrison. Ruth wants to refuse because she doesn't trust any man who'd gamble with people's lives. Grace thinks we should accept because she believes everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Hope wants to make you prove yourself before we commit to anything." "And what do you think?" Jack asked, genuinely curious about the opinion of the youngest sister who seemed to see more than anyone gave her credit for. "I think you're scared," Faith said simply. "Scared of staying, scared of leaving, scared of being responsible for us, and scared of being alone. But fear can make a person careful, and careful might be what we need right now." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the morning star bright above the eastern horizon and the air carrying the promise of another hot Texas day. The ranch looked different in the gray light before dawn, more settled somehow, as if the approaching day had awakened something in the land itself. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and Jack could see lamplight glowing warmly in the windows of the main house. The other 4 sisters were waiting in the kitchen when Faith led Jack through the front door. They sat around the same table where they'd met the day before, but the atmosphere was different now. There was a sense of decision in the air, of bridges burned and paths chosen, that made Jack's heart beat faster with anticipation and something that might have been hope. Mary stood as they entered, her movements graceful but businesslike in a way that suggested she'd taken charge of whatever deliberations had occurred during the night. "Mr. Sullivan," she said formally, "we've discussed your proposal, and we're prepared to accept it with certain conditions that we need to make clear from the beginning." Ruth leaned forward, her dark eyes intense with the kind of passion that could start wars or build empires depending on how it was directed. "First condition," she said firmly, "you work for your keep just like the rest of us. You're not a guest here, you're not our protector, and you're not our salvation. You're a partner, which means you pull your weight and earn your place." Grace's voice was softer but no less determined as she added the second condition. "You respect our decisions about how this ranch is run and how our family operates. We've been taking care of ourselves since our mother died, and we know what we're doing. Your job is to help, not to take over." Hope's contribution came with a challenging smile that dared Jack to object. "Third condition. You prove you're different from Morrison by treating us like equals, not property. The moment you start acting like you own us, or have the right to make decisions about our lives without consulting us, this partnership ends and you can deal with whatever consequences follow." Faith's condition was the simplest and perhaps the most important. "You tell us the truth," she said quietly, "about your past, about your intentions, about your fears and your plans. We're trusting you with our home and our future. The least you can do is trust us with your honesty." Jack found himself looking around the table at 5 faces that had made a collective decision to take a chance on a stranger, whose only qualification was that he wasn't Samuel Morrison. The weight of their trust settled on his shoulders like a familiar pack, heavy but not unwelcome. He'd spent 2 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, and now he was walking into it with his eyes wide open. "Ladies," he said slowly, "I accept your conditions, and I'll add one of my own. If I fail you, if I prove myself unworthy of your trust, or if I become more trouble than help, you tell me to leave and I'll go without argument or resentment. Your safety and prosperity matter more than my pride or my need to belong somewhere." Mary extended her hand across the table, and Jack shook it solemnly, sealing an agreement that none of them fully understood, but all of them were willing to honor. "Welcome to the Henderson Ranch, partner," she said with a small smile that transformed her serious face into something approaching warmth. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Jack wondering how 5 women had managed to keep the ranch running as well as they had with so little help. The Henderson place covered nearly 2,000 acres of good grazing land, with water rights that made it valuable in a region where rivers could disappear in dry years and springs were worth fighting over. But the ranch had been neglected during the years when the sisters were struggling just to survive Morrison's predatory contracts, and there was a mountain of work waiting for anyone willing to tackle it. Jack threw himself into the labor with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He'd spent his cavalry years following orders and his drifting years avoiding commitment, but working the Henderson ranch felt different. Every fence he mended, every corral he repaired, every head of cattle he helped move to better pasture was an investment in something that belonged partly to him. Not owned in the legal sense that Morrison had claimed, but earned through sweat and dedication and the growing sense that he was building something rather than just passing through. The sisters had divided the ranch work according to their individual strengths and preferences, creating a system that maximized their limited resources while ensuring that nothing essential was neglected. Mary handled the business side of the operation, keeping books and managing correspondence with buyers and suppliers. Her intelligence and education, inherited from a mother who had insisted on teaching her daughters to read and write despite their frontier circumstances, made her a formidable negotiator when dealing with merchants who tried to take advantage of women ranchers. Ruth managed the livestock with an intuitive understanding of cattle that would have impressed veteran cowboys twice her age. She could read the weather in the way animals moved, predict sickness before symptoms appeared, and calm a spooked horse with nothing more than her voice and steady hands. Jack found himself learning from her despite his years of cavalry experience, discovering that there was a difference between managing horses for war and caring for animals that represented a family's livelihood. Grace took charge of the domestic side of ranch life, managing the household, tending the garden, and handling the complex logistics of feeding and clothing 5 people on a budget that left no room for waste or luxury. Her quiet efficiency kept the family fed and comfortable even when money was scarce, and her skill with needle and thread meant that clothing lasted years longer than it should have and still looked respectable when they rode into town. Hope worked wherever she was needed most, throwing herself into every task with an energy that seemed inexhaustible and a determination that brooked no argument from man or beast. She could rope and brand cattle, break horses, fix machinery, and handle a rifle with equal skill, adapting to whatever the day demanded with the flexibility that came from growing up on a working ranch, where everyone did whatever needed doing. Faith, despite her youth, had become the ranch's informal veterinarian and herbalist, combining knowledge passed down from her Comanche grandfather with practical experience gained from years of caring for sick animals. She could set a broken bone, treat infected wounds, and brew medicines from prairie plants that worked better than anything available from the town doctor. Her gentle touch and intuitive understanding of animal behavior made her invaluable when dealing with difficult births or injured livestock. Jack found his place in this well-organized system by handling the heavy labor that had been beyond the sisters' physical capabilities and providing security against the various threats that plague isolated ranches. He repaired buildings, dug wells, moved heavy equipment, and stood watch during the long nights when rustlers or predators might threaten the livestock. More importantly, his presence served as a deterrent to the kind of men who might have seen 5 women alone as an opportunity for mischief. But it was the evenings that revealed the true nature of what they were building together. After the day's work was done and the chores completed, the 6 of them would gather around the kitchen table for meals that stretched long into the night, filled with conversation about everything from cattle prices to politics to the stories and songs that Mary had learned from their mother and Ruth remembered from their father's people. Jack found himself talking about his cavalry years, sharing stories he'd never told anyone about the friends he'd lost and the mistakes he'd made and the gradual erosion of certainty that had driven him to leave the army and start drifting. Sisters listened without judgment, offering their own memories of loss and struggle and the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving when survival seemed impossible. It was during one of these evening conversations that Jack learned about Joseph Henderson, the Comanche warrior who had married their white mother and given his daughters a heritage that was both blessing and burden in a world that had little patience for people who didn't fit neatly into established categories. The sisters spoke of him with a mixture of love and loss that Jack recognized from his own feelings about his fallen cavalry brothers. "Papa was a war chief," Faith said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. "Iron Wolf," they called him in his own language. He could track a grasshopper across solid rock and read the weather in the way birds flew. But he gave up the war trail when he met our mother, chose love over duty to his people. Mary's voice was soft with memory as she continued the story. "They said he was killed in a cavalry raid 3 years ago, trying to protect a band of women and children who were fleeing to Mexico. Mama never recovered from losing him. She just faded away like a flower in drought, no matter how hard we tried to bring her back to us." Jack found himself thinking about the reports he'd filed during his own cavalry service, clinical descriptions of engagements with hostile Indians that reduced complex human tragedies to numbers on a page. How many men like Joseph Henderson had he helped pursue? How many families had been torn apart by the conflict between peoples who both believed they were fighting for their survival and their way of life? The thought troubled him during the long hours of night watch when he walked the perimeter of the ranch with a rifle in his hands and questions in his heart. The Henderson sisters had accepted him despite his military past, but would their father have done the same? Was Jack helping to preserve the family of a man he might have fought against if circumstances had been different? These philosophical concerns took a back seat to more immediate problems when Samuel Morrison began making his presence felt around the ranch. The saloon owner had accepted his poker loss with apparent grace, but Jack soon realized that Morrison was not a man who forgot grudges or abandoned profitable ventures without a fight. At first, the interference was subtle. Supplies ordered from town arrived damaged or not at all, with merchants offering stammering explanations about accidents and delays that happened suspiciously often to Henderson ranch orders. Cattle buyers who had previously done business with the sisters suddenly became unavailable or offered prices so low that accepting them would have meant working for free. Even the mail seemed to go astray more often than chance should have allowed. Ruth was the first to connect these incidents to Morrison's influence in town. "He's trying to strangle us slowly," she said during a family meeting called to address. "They're mounting difficulties. Make it impossible for us to operate profitably, so we'll have to come crawling back to him for help." Hope's response was typically direct. "Then we need to make it clear that we won't be strangled. Show Morrison and his allies that we're not the same desperate women who signed those contracts 3 years ago." Jack found himself caught between admiration for their courage and concern for their safety. Morrison had connections throughout the county, including Deputy Bradley and several of the larger ranchers, who saw the Henderson place as an obstacle to their own expansion plans. Starting a fight with such a powerful coalition could result in consequences far worse than economic harassment. But the decision was taken out of their hands when Morrison's campaign moved from subtle interference to direct confrontation. Jack was in town picking up supplies when he overheard a conversation in the general store that made his blood run cold. Morrison was talking to 3 men Jack recognized as hired guns, discussing plans for a raid on the Henderson ranch that would leave the sisters with no choice but to accept his protection or face worse consequences. Jack slipped out of the store and rode hard for the ranch, pushing Bandit to his limits as he raced against time and the approaching darkness. He found the sisters preparing for another quiet evening, unaware that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered by men who saw their independence as an affront to the natural order of things. "We need to talk," Jack said as he burst through the front door, his urgency immediately putting everyone on alert. "Morrison's planning something for tonight. Something that's going to change everything, whether we're ready for it or not." The conversation that followed was brief and decisive. The sisters had grown up on the frontier, where survival often depended on the ability to make life or death decisions quickly and live with the consequences. Within minutes, they had transformed from a peaceful ranching family into a defensive unit prepared to fight for everything they'd built together. Jack checked and loaded weapons while Mary secured important papers, and Ruth moved the horses to a corral that couldn't be seen from the main road. Grace and Hope positioned themselves at windows that commanded views of the approaches to the house, while Faith prepared medical supplies in case anyone was wounded in the coming confrontation. As full darkness settled over the ranch and the first stars appeared in the clear Texas sky, 6 people waited in the Henderson house for whatever Morrison had planned to bring to their door. They had chosen to stand together rather than surrender to intimidation, and now they would discover whether their unity was strong enough to survive the test that was coming with the night wind across the prairie. The attack came with the howl of coyotes and the thunder of hoofbeats that shook the ground beneath the Henderson house. Jack counted at least 8 riders circling the ranch buildings, their torches casting dancing shadows that turned the familiar landscape into something from a nightmare. Morrison had brought more men than Jack had overheard him discussing, which meant either he'd recruited additional help, or this was meant to be more than just intimidation. "Ruth, take the back window," Jack called out as he checked the loads. In his rifle, "Mary, you and Grace cover the sides. Hope, stay with Faith in the center room and be ready to move if anyone gets through." His cavalry training had taught him to assess tactical situations quickly, and what he saw made his stomach tighten with worry. The ranch house was defensible, but they were outnumbered and surrounded by men who had chosen violence over negotiation. The first shots came without warning, muzzle flashes erupting from the darkness as bullets shattered windows and splintered the wooden walls of the house. Jack returned fire immediately, his rifle barking in rapid succession as he tried to identify targets among the moving shadows. Beside him, Mary worked her father's old Spencer carbine with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed. "They're trying to set the barn on fire," Ruth shouted from her position at the rear of the house. Her rifle cracked twice in quick succession, and one of the torches went spinning into the darkness as its carrier pitched from his saddle. "Got him, but there are two more heading for the corral." Jack could smell smoke drifting through the broken windows, acrid and bitter in the night air. Morrison's men were trying to destroy the ranch piece by piece, burning buildings and scattering livestock in an effort to break the Henderson family's ability to resist. It was the kind of total warfare that Jack had seen too often during his cavalry years, and he knew that if they didn't stop it quickly, there would be nothing left to defend. "I'm going out there," Jack said, checking his ammunition and preparing to make a run for the barn. "If they burn us out, we'll have to surrender or die, and I won't let either of those things happen to this family." Mary's hand on his arm stopped him before he could reach the door. "You're not going alone," she said firmly. "This is our fight as much as yours, and we don't abandon family when things get dangerous." Hope appeared at Jack's other side, her young face set with determination that brooked no argument. "Ruth and Grace can hold the house. Faith's safe in the center room. Mary and I are coming with you." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to protect these women who had become more important to him than his own life, but he could see in their eyes the same steel that had carried them through 3 years of struggle against Morrison's predatory contracts. They weren't helpless victims waiting to be saved. They were warriors fighting for their home, and they had every right to stand beside him in that fight. The three of them slipped out through the kitchen door, moving carefully through the shadows, toward the barn where flames were already beginning to lick at the wooden walls. Jack could hear Morrison's voice shouting orders from somewhere in the darkness, directing his men with the confidence of someone who believed victory was inevitable. The sound of that voice, thick with satisfaction and cruelty, made Jack's jaw clench with anger that went beyond mere tactical considerations. They reached the barn just as 2 of Morrison's men were preparing to spread the fire to the hay stored in the loft. Jack's first shot took down the man with the torch, while Mary's rifle accounted for his companion before he could draw his pistol. Hope immediately began stamping out the flames that had started to spread along the wooden wall, her movements quick and efficient despite the chaos surrounding them. "Jack Sullivan." Morrison's voice carried clearly across the ranch yard, amplified by anger and the confidence of superior numbers. "You've cost me a considerable amount of money and inconvenience. Send out those women and we'll settle this like civilized men." Jack stepped into the open space between the barn and house, his rifle ready but not immediately threatening. "Morrison," he called back, "you're the one who started this fight. You could have accepted your losses and moved on, but you chose to bring violence to women who never did you any harm." Morrison emerged from the shadows near the corral, flanked by 2 gunmen whose relaxed postures suggested they considered this confrontation already won. "Those women signed contracts with me," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of righteous indignation that evil men used to justify their actions. Legal contracts that gave me certain rights and expectations. You stole them from me in a crooked poker game, and now you're going to pay the price for your interference. The only thing crooked about that poker game was your assumption that you couldn't lose, Jack replied, keeping his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. You gambled with human lives and lost. That's not theft, that's justice. Morrison's laugh was ugly in the darkness. Justice? Boy, you don't know what justice looks like in this part of Texas. Justice is what men like me decide it is. And I've decided that you and those half-breed whores need to learn some respect for your betters. The words hit Jack like a physical blow, not because they were directed at him, but because of the casual cruelty with which Morrison dismissed 5 women who had shown more courage and honor than most men Jack had known. The Henderson sisters weren't just his partners or his responsibility anymore. They were his family, and family was worth fighting for regardless of the odds. You made a mistake coming here tonight, Morrison, Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that experienced fighters recognized as more dangerous than shouting. You made an even bigger mistake threatening my family. The gunfight that followed was brief and vicious, the kind of close-quarters combat that separated professionals from amateurs with ruthless efficiency. Jack's cavalry training served him well, but it was Mary's steady rifle fire and Hope's fearless charge that turned the tide of battle. When the shooting stopped, 3 of Morrison's men lay dead in the ranch yard. 2 more were wounded and fleeing into the darkness, and Morrison himself was on his knees with Mary's rifle barrel pressed against the back of his neck. Don't kill him, Jack said as he approached, seeing the fury in Mary's eyes and understanding the temptation she was fighting. He's not worth making yourself into a murderer, and we need him alive to answer for what he's done. Mary's hands shook slightly as she maintained her grip on the rifle, but her voice was steady when she spoke. He called us whores, she said simply. He threatened our home and our family. Men have died for less on this frontier. Jack gently placed his hand over Mary's on the rifle stock, not taking the weapon away, but offering support for whatever decision she made. You're right, he said quietly. He deserves to die for what he's done and what he planned to do. But you don't deserve to carry the weight of his death for the rest of your life. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of justice and mercy and the kind of moral complexity that frontier life imposed on people who just wanted to live in peace. Finally, Mary stepped back, lowering the rifle but keeping it ready in case Morrison tried to take advantage of her restraint. Get off our land, she said to Morrison, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just proven herself in battle. Take your wounded and get out. If you ever come back here, if you ever threaten this family again, I won't be so merciful next time. Morrison struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. This isn't over, he snarled, backing toward his horse while keeping his eyes on the 3 rifles trained on him. I've got friends in this county, connections you can't imagine. You think you've won something here, but all you've done is sign your own death warrants. Hope stepped forward, her young face hard with an anger that seemed far too mature for her 18 years. Maybe, she said conversationally, but you won't be alive to see it. Because if you threaten this family again, if you so much as look at one of us wrong, I'll hunt you down like the rabid dog you are and put you out of everyone's misery. Morrison mounted his horse and rode away into the darkness, followed by his surviving men who seemed more interested in escaping than in continuing the fight. The ranch yard fell silent except for the sound of crackling flames from the barn and the distant calling of night birds disturbed by the violence. Jack found himself shaking as the adrenaline drained from his system, replaced by the profound relief of having survived a fight that could have destroyed everything he'd come to care about. He looked around at the Henderson ranch, seeing the bullet holes in the house walls and the scorch marks on the barn, but also seeing something more important. He saw home, defended successfully by a family that had chosen to stand together against forces that would have destroyed them individually. Ruth and Grace emerged from the house, followed by Faith, who had ignored orders to stay in the center room and had instead prepared medical supplies for treating any wounded family members. The 5 sisters gathered around Jack in the ranch yard, their faces showing the strain of battle, but also the satisfaction of victory achieved through courage and unity. "Is everyone all right?" Mary asked, her voice betraying the worry she'd hidden during the fight. "Any injuries? Any serious damage?" Jack looked around at the faces of his chosen family, seeing scratches and bruises, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and care. "We're all fine," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Better than fine. We're together, and we're safe, and we've proven something important tonight." Faith stepped closer to Jack, her young face serious in the moonlight. "What did we prove?" she asked quietly. Jack considered the question, thinking about the months since that poker game had changed all their lives. "We proved that family isn't just about blood," he said finally. "It's about people who choose to stand together when things get difficult. It's about finding the place where you belong and being willing to fight for it." Hope laughed, a sound that carried relief and triumph in equal measure. "Does this mean you're done running, Jack Sullivan?" she asked. "Because I don't think any of us could survive another homecoming like this one." Jack looked around at the faces of the 5 women who had taken a chance on a drifting cowboy and somehow transformed him into something better than he'd ever thought he could be. "I'm done running," he said firmly. "This is my home now, and you're my family. Nothing Morrison or anyone else can do will change that." The weeks that followed brought changes that no one could have predicted. Deputy Bradley, faced with testimony from 6 witnesses about Morrison's attack on the Henderson ranch, found himself forced to choose between his corrupt allegiances and his duty to uphold the law. The evidence was too clear, and the political pressure too strong for him to ignore, especially when several prominent citizens came forward to support the Henderson family's version of events. Morrison himself fled Copper Ridge before formal charges could be filed, leaving behind debts and enemies that quickly moved to claim his abandoned properties. The Silver Dollar Saloon was sold to pay creditors, and the new owner made it clear that the Henderson family would always be welcome there. Morrison's other business interests were similarly divided among people who had suffered under his predatory practices, creating a kind of rough justice that satisfied the community's sense of fairness. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. Jack was working in the north pasture when he saw a lone rider approaching the ranch, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to the land he rode across. As the figure drew closer, Jack realized with a shock that he was looking at a Comanche warrior in full traditional dress, his horse painted for war and his face decorated with symbols that spoke of high rank and dangerous intentions. Jack rode hard for the ranch house, his heart pounding with the realization that their troubles were far from over. He found the 5 sisters on the front porch, but instead of the alarm he expected to see, their faces showed a mixture of joy and disbelief. That stopped him cold. "Papa," Faith whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Papa's come home." Joseph Henderson, known to his people as Iron Wolf, sat his painted horse at the edge of the ranch yard like a figure from legend. His weathered face was painted with war symbols, his long hair was braided with feathers and beads, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that came from men who had spent their lives fighting for survival in a world that offered no mercy to the weak. "My daughters," he said in English, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief and the warmth of a father, "I have come to take you home to our people, where you will be safe from the white man's greed and violence." Mary stepped forward, her face showing the conflict between love for her father and loyalty to the life they'd built. "Papa," she said softly, "we thought you were dead. We mourned you for 3 years. We built a life here, a good life with people who care about us. Iron Wolf's eyes moved to Jack, studying him with the kind of attention that could read a man's character in the set of his shoulders and the way he held his weapons. "You are the one who claims ownership of my daughters," he said, his voice carrying a quiet menace that made Jack's cavalry training kick in. "You are the one who thinks he can buy and sell the children of Iron Wolf like cattle in a market." Jack dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I've never claimed ownership of your daughters. I won contracts that gave me legal rights to their labor, but I've never exercised those rights. Your daughters are free to make their own choices about their lives and their future." Iron Wolf studied Jack for a long moment, his dark eyes searching for deception or weakness. "You speak of freedom," he said finally, "but you carry the smell of the Bluecoat cavalry. You have fought against my people. You have killed Comanche warriors who were protecting their families and their way of life." The accusation hit Jack like a physical blow because it was true. He had fought in the Indian Wars, had participated in actions that had resulted in Comanche deaths, had been part of the military machine that had driven Iron Wolf's people from their ancestral lands. There was no way to deny his past or to justify his actions to a man who had lost everything to the conflict between two incompatible ways of life. "You're right," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old guilt and new understanding. "I fought in the wars. I followed orders that resulted in the deaths of your people. I can't undo what I've done, and I can't claim that I was just following orders, because every man is responsible for his own actions." Ruth stepped down from the porch, her face showing the same mixture of love and defiance that had characterized her relationship with every authority figure she'd ever encountered. "Papa," she said firmly, "Jack isn't our enemy. He's our partner, our friend, our family. He's helped us save this ranch and build a life that honors both sides of our heritage." Iron Wolf's attention shifted to his second daughter, and Jack could see the love in his eyes even through the war paint and the ceremonial distance. "You speak of honor," Iron Wolf said, "but what honor is there in working for the people who killed your father's brothers and stole your father's land?" Grace joined her sisters in the yard, her gentle voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "The honor is in building something better than what came before," she said quietly. "The honor is in showing that people from different worlds can live together in peace and mutual respect." Hope and Faith moved to stand with their sisters, creating a united front that faced their father with love but also with determination. "We're not abandoning our heritage," Hope said boldly. "We're expanding it. We're proving that the strength you gave us can be used to build bridges instead of walls." Iron Wolf looked at his 5 daughters, seeing in their faces the same courage and independence that had made him a legendary war chief. But he also saw something else, a happiness and sense of belonging that spoke of lives lived on their own terms rather than in response to external pressures. "You choose this life?" he asked them. "You choose this man and this place over the safety and traditions of your people?" Mary spoke for all of them when she answered. "We choose the life we've built together," she said firmly. "We choose the family we've created, which includes Jack and includes you if you'll accept it. We choose to honor our mother's memory and your teachings by proving that love is stronger than hate and that families can be built on more than just blood." Jack found himself holding his breath as Iron Wolf considered his daughter's words. The war chief's decision would determine not just Jack's fate, but the future of the fragile unity they'd all worked so hard to build. If Iron Wolf chose to take his daughters back to the Comanche band, if he decided that Jack represented a threat to their safety and identity, then everything they'd built together would crumble into dust. Finally, Iron Wolf dismounted from his painted horse and walked slowly toward the group gathered in the ranch yard. His war paint seemed less threatening now, more ceremonial than aggressive, and his eyes held the kind of deep sadness that came from men who had seen too much loss and carried too much responsibility. "I came here to take my daughters home," he said quietly. "But I see that they have already found their home. I came here to protect them from danger, but I see that they have learned to protect themselves and each other." He stopped directly, in front of Jack, close enough that Jack could see the scars on his weathered face and the silver threads in his braided hair. "You have made yourself responsible for my daughter's safety and happiness," Iron Wolf said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal authority. "If you fail them, if you betray their trust, if you cause them pain through your weakness or selfishness, I will find you wherever you run, and I will make you pay for every tear they shed." Jack met the war chief's eyes steadily, understanding that this was both a threat and an acceptance. "I understand," he said simply. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of their trust and your approval." Iron Wolf nodded slowly, then turned to his daughters. "I have been living with the ghosts of the past for too long," he said, his voice softening with emotion. "Perhaps it is time to learn from the living instead of mourning the dead." The reunion that followed was everything Jack had hoped for, and more. Iron Wolf agreed to stay at the ranch for several weeks, helping with the work and sharing stories of the family's heritage that filled in gaps the sisters had wondered about for years. He taught them traditional songs and dances, showed them how to read weather signs and track game, and gradually came to understand that they had built something genuinely worthy of pride. For Jack, those weeks were a kind of redemption he'd never expected to find. Iron Wolf's initial suspicion gradually gave way to respect and then to something approaching friendship as the war chief observed Jack's dedication to his daughter's welfare. The two men shared stories of their military experiences, finding common ground in their understanding of duty and sacrifice and the weight of command. The transformation was complete when Iron Wolf participated in a ceremony that formalized Jack's place in the Henderson family. Using traditions that blended Comanche customs with elements borrowed from Mexican and Anglo cultures, Iron Wolf formally adopted Jack as a son and brother, creating bonds that transcended the legal documents that had first brought them together. 6 months after the poker game that had changed everything, Jack Sullivan stood on the porch of the Henderson ranch, watching the sun set over land that belonged to him, not through ownership, but through belonging. Mary was beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his, while her sisters worked in the garden and Iron Wolf taught Faith the proper way to prepare traditional medicines. "Do you ever regret it?" Mary asked quietly, her voice carrying the kind of intimate warmth that came from people who had shared danger and victory together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd folded that night instead of calling Morrison's bluff?" Jack considered the question, thinking about the lonely years of drifting and the hollow victories that had meant nothing because there was no one to share them with. "I regret the years I spent running," he said finally. "I regret the time I wasted being afraid of exactly this kind of happiness. But I don't regret the card game, and I don't regret the choice to stay and fight for something worth having." Mary smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something radiant with contentment. "Good," she said simply, "because we're not done building yet. This ranch, this family, this life we've created together, it's just the beginning of what we can accomplish when we work together." Jack pulled her closer, feeling the solid reality of her warmth and the promise of a future that stretched out before them like an open road. He'd won 5 sisters in a poker game, but he'd gained something far more valuable, a sense of belonging that no amount of money could buy and no twist of fate could take away. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady, above the western horizon. Jack made a silent promise to that star, to the land around him, and to the family that had taught him the difference between existing and living. He would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of the trust they'd placed in him, building on the foundation they'd laid together, and making sure that the Henderson Ranch remained a place where people could find belonging regardless of where they'd come from or what they'd done before. As the first stars appeared in the vast Texas sky, Jack Sullivan finally understood what he'd been searching for during all those lonely years on the trail. He'd been looking for home, and he'd found it in the most unexpected place in the hearts of 5 women who had taught him that the best families were built not on blood, but on choice. Not on ownership, but on love, and not on the past, but on the courage to build something better together. The autumn of 1886 brought changes to Copper Ridge that nobody could have predicted when Jack Sullivan first rode into town with $27 and a tired horse. The Henderson Ranch had become the most prosperous spread in the county. Its success built on the foundation of hard work, mutual respect, and the kind of innovative thinking that came from blending different traditions and approaches to the challenges of frontier life. Jack stood in the main corral, watching Iron Wolf work with a young stallion that had been considered unbreakable by every horse trader in 3 counties. The war chief's approach combined patience with an intuitive understanding of animal psychology that made even the most stubborn horses respond to his gentle but firm guidance. At 53, Iron Wolf moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his weathered hands steady on the lead rope as he guided the stallion through its paces. "He's learning to trust," Iron Wolf said quietly, his English now carrying only the faintest trace of accent after months of daily conversation with his daughters and their chosen brother. Trust is the foundation of all partnerships, whether between man and horse or between people who choose to build a life together. Jack nodded, understanding that Iron Wolf was talking about more than just horse training. The war chief's integration into ranch life had been gradual but complete, his traditional knowledge combining with modern ranching techniques to create innovations that their neighbors were beginning to copy. Iron Wolf's ability to read weather patterns had saved their cattle from 2 flash floods. His understanding of plant medicine had kept their livestock healthy through a difficult summer, and his connections with other Comanche bands had opened new trading opportunities that brought prosperity to the entire community. The relationship between Jack and Iron Wolf had evolved from wary mutual respect to genuine friendship, built on shared experiences and the common goal of protecting and providing for the 5 remarkable women who formed the heart of their unconventional family. They had worked side by side through the demanding tasks of ranch life, fought together against rustlers and predators, and spent countless evenings sharing stories that bridged the gap between their different backgrounds and experiences. "You've changed since you came here," Iron Wolf observed, releasing the stallion into the corral and turning his attention to Jack. "When I first saw you, you carried yourself like a man who was running from something. Now you move like someone who has found his place in the world." Jack considered the observation, thinking about the restless years of drifting that had preceded his arrival in Copper Ridge. "I was running," he admitted. "Running from responsibility, from commitment, from the possibility of caring about something enough that losing it would destroy me. I thought independence meant being alone, and I thought being alone meant being safe." Iron Wolf's smile carried the wisdom of a man who had learned hard lessons about the difference between solitude and isolation. "The white man's way often confuses independence with abandonment," he said thoughtfully. "My people understand that true strength comes from the bonds we choose to honor, not from the things we choose to avoid." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Jack looked up to see Mary and Ruth returning from town with supplies and what appeared to be important news. Mary's face showed the kind of controlled excitement that suggested significant developments, while Ruth's expression held the satisfaction of someone who had just achieved a long-sought victory. "Jack, Papa," Mary called as she dismounted near the corral. "We need to gather everyone together. There's been a development regarding Morrison that changes everything about our situation here." Within minutes, the entire family had assembled on the front porch of the main house, the same location where they had made so many important decisions over the past year. Grace brought coffee and fresh baked bread, while Faith settled beside, Iron Wolf, with the comfortable familiarity of a daughter who had rediscovered her father's presence in her life. Hope perched on the porch railing, her energy barely contained, as she waited to hear whatever news Mary and Ruth had brought from town. Mary's announcement was both expected and surprising in its scope. "Morrison's been arrested," she said without preamble. Federal marshals caught up with him in El Paso, where he'd been operating a confidence scheme that targeted railroad investors. Apparently, his activities here in Copper Ridge were just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise that spanned several territories. Ruth's grin was fierce with satisfaction as she continued the story. "The marshals were very interested in our testimony about his operations here. Seems Morrison had been using similar tactics in other communities, trapping families in debt contracts and then seizing their property when they couldn't pay. Our case helped them establish a pattern of fraud that will put him away for a very long time." Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Morrison's defeat in their ranch yard confrontation had ended the immediate threat, but the saloon owner's connections and resources had meant that the danger of future retaliation always lurked in the background. Knowing that Morrison was finally facing justice for his crimes brought a sense of closure that allowed Jack to fully embrace the future they were building together. "There's more," Mary continued, her excitement now barely contained. "The federal investigation has led to the recovery of property and money that Morrison stole from dozens of families over the years. The territorial government is establishing a fund to compensate his victims, and they've asked us to help identify other families who might have claims against his estate." Iron Wolf's response reflected the practical wisdom of someone who had spent his life navigating complex political situations. "This is good news for justice," he said thoughtfully, "but it also brings responsibility. Other families will look to us for leadership and guidance. We must be prepared to help them rebuild their lives just as we rebuilt ours." Hope's enthusiasm for new challenges was immediately apparent. "We could expand the ranch," she suggested, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Bring in other families who need a fresh start. Create a community where people from different backgrounds can work together and prosper." Grace's more cautious nature provided a necessary counterbalance to Hope's excitement. "We'd need to be careful about how we grow," she pointed out. "The success we've achieved comes from the trust and cooperation we've built as a family. Adding too many people too quickly could disrupt the harmony that makes everything else possible." Faith's contribution reflected her unique perspective as the youngest member of their group, but also the one who often saw things that others missed. "Maybe the question isn't whether we should help other families," she said quietly, "but how. We can share what we've learned about building something better than what came before." The discussion that followed stretched well into the evening, ranging over topics from practical concerns about expanding their operations to philosophical questions about their responsibilities to the broader community. Jack found himself thinking about the lonely cowboy who had ridden into Copper Ridge with nothing but a tired horse and a handful of coins, and marveling at how much his understanding of success and happiness had changed. As autumn deepened into winter, the Henderson ranch became a destination for families seeking new opportunities and fresh starts. Word had spread about the innovative approaches they were using to blend different cultural traditions and ranching techniques, and their success in creating a prosperous operation that honored both individual dignity and collective cooperation attracted attention from across the territory. Jack's role in these developments had evolved naturally from protector and partner to something resembling a community leader, though he was careful to share decision-making authority with the Henderson sisters and Iron Wolf. His cavalry experience proved valuable in organizing work crews and managing complex projects, while his outsider's perspective helped him identify opportunities that longtime residents might have overlooked. The first family to join their expanded operation was the Vasquez clan, whose patriarch had lost his ranch to one of Morrison's fraudulent schemes, but possessed valuable knowledge about irrigation and crop rotation that complemented the Henderson family's expertise in livestock management. Elena Vasquez, who had befriended the sisters during their difficult early years, brought skills in traditional crafts and herbal medicine that enhanced their ability to be self-sufficient. The integration of the Vasquez family went smoothly, partly because their shared experience of Morrison's predatory practices created an immediate bond of understanding, but mostly because the Henderson sisters had developed a gift for making newcomers feel welcomed and valued. Mary's business acumen helped the expanded operation maintain profitability. Ruth's livestock expertise ensured that their herds continued to thrive. Grace's domestic management kept everyone fed and comfortable. Hope's energy tackled whatever challenges arose, and Faith's medical knowledge kept both people and animals healthy. Iron Wolf's presence proved crucial in establishing relationships with other Comanche bands and mixed heritage families who had been marginalized by both white and Indian communities. His reputation as a war chief commanded respect, while his obvious devotion to his daughters and acceptance of Jack demonstrated that cooperation between different peoples was not only possible but profitable. By the spring of 1887, the Henderson Ranch had grown into something resembling a small town, with multiple families working interconnected operations that supported each other's prosperity while maintaining individual identity and autonomy. They had established their own school, taught by Grace and supplemented by Iron Wolf's lessons in traditional knowledge and Jack's instruction in practical skills like horsemanship and marksmanship. The success of their community attracted attention from territorial officials who were struggling to manage the complex challenges of governing a region where different cultures and traditions often came into conflict. Jack found himself appointed as an unofficial mediator for disputes between ranchers and remaining Comanche bands, a role that utilized his military experience and growing reputation for fairness and practical problem-solving. These responsibilities brought Jack into contact with other former cavalry officers who had chosen to remain in the West after their military service ended, and he was surprised to discover how many of them envied the sense of purpose and belonging he had found. Some had become successful businessmen or political leaders, but few had achieved the kind of personal satisfaction that came from building something meaningful with people who truly mattered to them. One evening in late spring, as Jack and Mary walked through the expanded ranch complex checking on the various operations that now fell under their oversight, she asked him a question that had been on her mind for months. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of those early days when it was just the six of us working to save a failing ranch?" Jack considered the question carefully, looking around at the bustling community they had helped create. Children played in the yards between houses, men worked together to repair a wagon wheel, women gathered to share news and plan community projects, and the sounds of prosperity and contentment filled the evening air. "I miss the intimacy of our smaller family," he said honestly, "but I don't miss the uncertainty and constant struggle. What we've built here is bigger than what any of us could have achieved alone, and it's going to outlast all of us. That gives everything we do a kind of permanence that I never thought I'd be part of." Mary's smile reflected the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only achieved her goals, but exceeded them in ways she had never imagined. Ruth was right when she said we weren't property to be won in a poker game, she said thoughtfully. But I think she was wrong about one thing. You didn't win us that night. We won each other. The observation touched something deep in Jack's chest, a recognition of truth that went beyond mere sentiment to encompass the fundamental reality of what they had accomplished together. The legal documents that had first brought them together were long since irrelevant, replaced by bonds of choice and commitment that no contract could capture or court could dissolve. As summer arrived with its demands for increased activity and constant vigilance against the various threats that plagued frontier communities, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him from lonely drifter to respected community leader. The transformation had not been easy or automatic. requiring him to confront fears and weaknesses he had spent years avoiding. But the rewards had exceeded anything he had thought possible. The Henderson ranch's prosperity had attracted the attention of larger ranching operations and business interests who saw opportunity in their innovative approaches to labor management and community organization. Several offers had been made to purchase their operation or to bring them into partnership with established cattle barons, but the family had unanimously decided to maintain their independence while sharing their knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn. Jack's relationship with Mary had deepened into something that transcended the practical partnership that had originally brought them together, evolving into the kind of love that was built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the daily choice to prioritize each other's welfare above individual concerns. They had not formalized their relationship with marriage, preferring to let their commitment speak through actions rather than ceremonies, though everyone in the community understood that they were partners in every meaningful sense of the word. The other Henderson sisters had also found their own paths to happiness and fulfillment within the expanding community. Ruth had become the acknowledged expert on livestock management for the entire region, her reputation drawing visitors from neighboring territories who wanted to learn from her innovative techniques. Grace had established a school that attracted families from dozens of miles away, her patient teaching methods helping both children and adults develop skills that improved their prospects for success. Hope had discovered a talent for negotiation and conflict resolution that made her invaluable in managing the complex relationships between different families and cultural groups within their community. Her fearless approach to confronting problems and her genuine concern for fairness had earned her respect from people who might otherwise have dismissed her opinions because of her youth and gender. Faith had developed into a healer whose reputation extended far beyond their immediate community, combining traditional Comanche medicine with techniques learned from Mexican curanderas and practical experience gained from treating everything from difficult childbirths to serious injuries. Her gentle manner and intuitive understanding of both human and animal psychology made her someone that people sought out in times of crisis. Iron Wolf had become something of a legend in the region, his transformation from feared war chief, respected community elder, providing a powerful example of how people could adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning their essential identity. His knowledge of traditional ways was preserved and passed on to younger generations, while his practical wisdom helped navigate the complex challenges of building bridges between different cultures. As autumn returned to mark the second anniversary of the poker game that had changed everything, Jack found himself standing once again at the edge of the ranch yard where Morrison's attack had been defeated through courage and unity. The scars from that night had long since been repaired, but the memory served as a reminder of what they had overcome and what they were capable of achieving when they worked together. The community celebration that evening brought together more than 100 people from dozens of families who had found new hope and prosperity through the example set by the Henderson Ranch. There was music and dancing that blended traditions from multiple cultures, food that combined recipes passed down through generations with innovations created through experimentation and necessity, and stories that honored both individual achievements and collective success. Jack's toast to the assembled crowd reflected his understanding of how much had changed since that night, when a lonely cowboy had risked everything on a hand of cards. 2 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly. In the crisp autumn air, I thought I was gambling with money and possessions that I could afford to lose. I thought the worst thing that could happen was that I'd end up walking away from Copper Ridge with nothing but the clothes on my back. He paused, looking around at the faces of people who had become more than friends, more than neighbors, more than family in the traditional sense. What I discovered was that I wasn't gambling with things I could afford to lose. I was gambling for things I couldn't afford to live without. The love of good people, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the security of belonging somewhere that matters. Mary's hand found his as he continued, her presence providing the kind of silent support that had sustained him through every challenge they had faced together. Tonight we celebrate not just our prosperity, but our proof that people from different backgrounds can build something better together than any of us could achieve alone. We celebrate the families who have joined us, the children who are growing up with opportunities their parents never had, and the future we're building one day at a time. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Jack knew that the real measure of their success was not in the approval of crowds, but in the daily choice that each person made to prioritize the common good over individual advantage. They had created something rare and precious in a world that often seemed determined to divide people into competing factions based on race, religion, culture, or economic status. As the celebration continued around them, Jack and Mary walked to the small cemetery where Iron Wolf's wife and Mary's mother lay buried, beneath headstones that bore inscriptions in 3 languages. The grave was well tended, decorated with flowers that bloomed in rotation throughout the growing season, a testament to the love that had inspired everything they had built together. She would be proud, Mary said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of deep satisfaction that came from honoring the memory of someone who had sacrificed everything for her children's future. Mama always believed that love was stronger than hate, that cooperation was better than conflict, that building was more important than destroying. Jack's arm tightened around Mary's shoulders as he thought about the woman he had never met, but whose influence was evident in every aspect of the life they had created. Your mother gave you and your sisters the strength to survive Morrison's schemes, and the wisdom to recognize when someone was offering genuine help instead of exploitation. Without those gifts, that poker game would have just been another tragedy, instead of the beginning of something beautiful. The moon was rising full and bright over the expanded ranch as they walked back toward the celebration, its silver light illuminating a landscape that had been transformed through human effort and divine grace into something approaching paradise. Children played in the yards between houses, their laughter carrying on the night breeze like a promise of continued joy and hope. Adults gathered in small groups to share news and plan future projects, their conversations reflecting the kind of long-term thinking that was possible only when people felt secure in their place and confident in their future. Jack's final reflection on the journey that had brought him to this moment centered on the recognition that true wealth had nothing to do with money or possessions, and everything to do with relationships and purpose. He had started as a man with $27 and a tired horse, gambling with strangers in a saloon where nobody knew his name or cared about his future. He had become a leader in a community where his welfare was intertwined with the welfare of dozens of other people, where his decisions affected not just his own life, but the lives of families who depended on the wisdom and integrity he brought to his responsibilities. The poker game that had started everything was now remembered as a turning point not just for the Henderson family, but for everyone who had been touched by the example they set and the opportunities they created. Morrison's defeat had removed a predator from their community, but their success in building something positive and lasting had provided hope and inspiration for people throughout the territory who were struggling to create better lives for themselves and their children. As the celebration wound down and families began to make their way home to houses scattered across the expanded ranch complex, Jack found himself surrounded by the 5 Henderson sisters and Iron Wolf, the core family unit that remained at the heart of everything they had accomplished. The bonds between them had deepened and evolved over 2 years of shared challenges and mutual support, creating relationships that transcended traditional categories and definitions. "So," Hope said with the mischievous grin that had characterized her approach to life since childhood, "what do you think, Jack Sullivan? Was it worth risking everything on a hand of cards to end up stuck with 5 sisters and a Comanche war chief for the rest of your life?" Jack's laughter was warm and genuine as he looked around at the faces of people who had transformed his understanding of what family meant and what life could offer to those brave enough to embrace both its challenges and its possibilities. "Best poker hand I ever played," he said simply. "Best decision I ever made. Best life I ever could have imagined." The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns as the Henderson ranch settled into peaceful sleep, its inhabitants secure in the knowledge that they had built something worth protecting and proud of the example they were setting for others who dreamed of creating communities based on cooperation rather than competition, inclusion rather than exclusion, love rather than fear. Jack's final thought before sleep claimed him was a prayer of gratitude for the chain of circumstances that had brought him to this place and these people. He had been a man running from commitment, who discovered that the right commitments were worth running toward. He had been a soldier without a cause who found that the best battles were fought not against enemies but for the people and principles that made life worth living. The lonely cowboy who had won 5 sisters in a poker game had become a man surrounded by family, prosperity, and purpose. His transformation complete, not because his journey was finished, but because he had finally learned the difference between wandering and traveling, between existing and living, between surviving and thriving in a world that offered both heartbreak and hope to those courageous enough to risk everything for the possibility of something better. The spring of 1888 arrived with unusual warmth and the promise of abundant rainfall, conditions that Iron Wolf read in the flight patterns of migrating birds and the early blooming of desert flowers. Standing on the ridge overlooking what had once been simply the Henderson Ranch but was now known throughout Texas as Harmony Valley, Jack Sullivan counted 47 separate dwellings, housing nearly 200 souls who had found refuge and prosperity under the protection of the community they had built together. The transformation was almost impossible to believe for someone who remembered the desperate circumstances that had brought them together just 3 years earlier. Where once there had been a struggling ranch worked by 5 women fighting against impossible odds, there was now a thriving settlement that served as a model for cooperation between peoples who had historically viewed each other as enemies. Apache families worked alongside former Confederate soldiers, Mexican vaqueros shared their knowledge with Comanche horsemen, and freed slaves found opportunities for advancement that were denied to them in the Reconstruction South. Jack's morning routine had evolved to accommodate his responsibilities as the unofficial mayor of this remarkable community. He began each day before dawn, walking the perimeter roads that connected the various family compounds while checking on livestock, examining irrigation systems, and observing the subtle signs that might indicate approaching weather or potential problems. These solitary hours allowed him to think through the complex decisions that affected so many lives, and to prepare for the steady stream of visitors who came seeking advice, arbitration, or simply the example of successful cooperation between diverse groups. The Henderson sisters had each found their own ways to contribute to the community's continued growth and prosperity. Mary had become a respected businesswoman whose network of contacts extended from San Antonio to Denver, her reputation for honest dealing and innovative solutions, making her a sought-after partner for ventures that required both capital and cultural sensitivity. She had established a trading company that specialized in products created by their community members, from Ruth's distinctive leather goods to Faith's medicinal preparations, creating markets that brought steady income to families who might otherwise have struggled to find economic opportunities. Ruth's expertise with horses and cattle had attracted attention from as far away as Montana, where ranchers were eager to learn the techniques she had developed for managing large herds with minimal loss to predators, disease, or harsh weather. She had begun accepting selected students who came to Harmony Valley for intensive training programs, their tuition fees providing additional revenue, while spreading knowledge that improved ranching practices throughout the region. Her reputation had grown to the point where territorial officials consulted her on policies related to livestock management and range conservation. Grace's school had evolved into something resembling a small college, with specialized instruction available in everything from basic literacy to advanced mathematics, from traditional crafts to modern agricultural techniques. Students came from hundreds of miles away to study under teachers who combined formal education with practical experience, creating a unique learning environment that prepared young people for success in a rapidly changing world. Grace's patient teaching methods and genuine concern for each student's individual development had made her a legendary figure among families seeking the best possible education for their children. Hope's natural talent for diplomacy and conflict resolution had led to her appointment as an official territorial mediator, a position that required her to travel extensively throughout Texas and neighboring regions to help resolve disputes between different communities and cultural groups. Her fearless approach to confronting difficult situations and her genuine commitment to finding solutions that honored everyone's dignity had earned her respect from territorial governors and tribal chiefs alike. Her success rate in achieving peaceful resolutions to potentially violent conflicts had made her one of the most valued public servants in the Southwest. Faith's development as a healer had taken her far beyond the traditional boundaries of folk medicine into areas that challenged the established medical profession's assumptions about what was possible when different healing traditions were combined. Intelligently, she had begun collaborating with doctors from major cities who came to Harmony Valley to study her methods and learn from her successes with conditions that conventional medicine struggled to treat. Her gentle manner and obvious competence had overcome skepticism about her youth and gender, establishing her as a genuine innovator in the field of frontier medicine. Iron Wolf's transformation from feared war chief to respected elder had become a powerful symbol of the possibility for former enemies to find common ground and mutual benefit. His knowledge of traditional ways had been carefully documented by scholars from universities in the East, while his practical wisdom continued to guide community decisions about everything from crop rotation to conflict resolution. His presence served as a bridge between the Comanche bands that remained in the region and the growing population of settlers, helping to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had led to so much bloodshed in earlier years. The success of Harmony Valley had attracted attention from government officials who were struggling to manage the complex challenges of territorial development while maintaining peace between different groups. Jack found himself appointed to a territorial commission, charged with developing policies for the integration of diverse populations, a responsibility that took him to the capital in Austin for several weeks each year, but always left him eager to return to the community that had become his true home. During one of these trips to Austin, Jack encountered several former cavalry officers who had chosen different paths after their military service ended. Some had become successful in business or politics, accumulating wealth and influence that exceeded anything Jack had achieved. But their conversations revealed a restless dissatisfaction that he recognized from his own years of drifting. They had gained material success, but lost the sense of purpose and belonging that came from being part of something larger than personal advancement. The contrast between their experiences and his own highlighted how much his understanding of success had changed since that night in the Silver Dollar Saloon when he had risked everything on a hand of cards. The measures of accomplishment that had once seemed important, money, status, independence from obligations to others, now appeared hollow compared to the richness of life, lived in genuine partnership with people whose welfare mattered more than his own comfort or convenience. Jack's relationship with Mary had deepened into something that transcended conventional categories of romance or partnership, becoming instead a collaboration that enhanced both of their individual capabilities while creating something together that neither could have achieved alone. They had chosen to formalize their commitment in a ceremony that blended traditions from multiple cultures, with Iron Wolf performing Comanche rituals, Father Santos providing Catholic blessings, and the entire community participating in celebrations that lasted for 3 days. Their wedding had become something of a legend throughout the territory, not because of its size or expense, but because of what it represented about the possibility for people from different backgrounds to create new traditions that honored their heritage while adapting to contemporary circumstances. The ceremony itself was simple and meaningful, focused on the promises they made to each other, rather than elaborate displays designed to impress observers. The vows they exchanged reflected the lessons they had learned about love and commitment through their shared experiences of building a life together under challenging circumstances. Jack promised to honor Mary's independence and intelligence, to support her ambitions and dreams, and to never let his own fears or weaknesses undermine the trust she had placed in him. Mary promised to stand with Jack through whatever challenges the future might bring, to value his welfare as highly as her own, and to help him continue growing into the man she had seen he could become, even when he couldn't see it himself. Their honeymoon had been spent visiting other communities throughout the Southwest that were attempting similar experiments in multicultural cooperation, studying their successes and failures while sharing their own experiences and insights. The trip had reinforced their understanding that what they had accomplished in Harmony Valley was both unique and replicable, given the right combination of leadership, circumstances, and commitment to the hard work of building bridges across cultural divides. The children of Harmony Valley represented perhaps the most hopeful aspect of their community's development, growing up with perspectives and opportunities that would have been impossible for their parents' generation. They played together without regard for the ethnic or cultural divisions that had historically separated their families, learned from teachers who represented multiple traditions and viewpoints, and developed skills and knowledge that prepared them for success in a world that was rapidly changing. Young Antonio Vasquez had become Jack's unofficial apprentice, showing remarkable aptitude for the kind of diplomatic and administrative work that kept the community functioning smoothly. At 16, he already demonstrated the kind of mature judgment and cultural sensitivity that made him valuable as a translator and mediator when visitors came from different backgrounds. His fluency in multiple languages and his deep understanding of various cultural traditions made him an ideal bridge between different groups within the community. Maria Santos, the daughter of a former Apache scout and a Mexican seamstress, had shown exceptional promise as a student under Grace's tutelage, mastering mathematics and science subjects with an ease that suggested she might pursue advanced education in one of the major cities. Her ambition was to become a teacher herself, returning to Harmony Valley to help expand the educational opportunities available to future generations of children who would grow up in their unique environment. Thomas Iron Wolf Henderson, the son of a Comanche warrior and a freed slave who had found love and acceptance in Harmony Valley, represented the literal future of their multicultural experiment. At 12 years old, he already showed his grandfather's intuitive understanding of horses and weather patterns, combined with his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's artistic sensibilities. His existence challenged conventional assumptions about racial categories while embodying the possibility for future generations to move beyond the prejudices that had limited their ancestors. The economic prosperity of Harmony Valley had become a subject of study for territorial officials who were trying to understand how a community with such diverse membership could achieve such remarkable success. The key seemed to be their emphasis on cooperation rather than competition, with different families and cultural groups contributing their unique strengths to collective enterprises that benefited everyone rather than pursuing individual advantage at the expense of community welfare. Jack's role in this economic development had evolved from ranch hand to something resembling a chief executive officer, coordinating the activities of multiple enterprises while ensuring that profits were distributed fairly among all contributors. His experience with military logistics proved valuable in organizing complex projects that required the coordination of many different skills and resources, while his growing understanding of various cultural approaches to business allowed him to navigate potential conflicts before they became serious problems. The trading post that Mary had established had grown into a commercial hub that attracted buyers from throughout the Southwest, drawn by the quality and uniqueness of products created by community members. Ruth's leather goods commanded premium prices from wealthy customers in San Antonio and Houston, while Faith's medicinal preparations were sought after by doctors who had heard about their effectiveness. Grace's educational materials were purchased by schools throughout the territory, and even Iron Vault's traditional crafts found markets among collectors who valued authentic Native American artwork. The agricultural experiments conducted by various families had resulted in innovations that increased crop yields while reducing the labor required for cultivation. The combination of traditional knowledge about drought-resistant plants with modern techniques for irrigation and soil management had allowed them to prosper even during years when neighboring communities struggled with poor harvests. Their success had attracted attention from agricultural colleges whose professors came to study their methods and document their results. The livestock operations overseen by Ruth had achieved similar innovations, with breeding programs that combined the hardiness of traditional southwestern cattle with the beef production capabilities of imported breeds. Her development of management techniques that minimized losses to predators while maintaining range sustainability had made their herds among the most profitable in the region, attracting buyers who were willing to pay premium prices for animals that had been raised using her methods. The reputation of Harmony Valley for peaceful coexistence between different groups had made it a destination for territorial officials seeking solutions to conflicts that threatened to disrupt development. In other regions, Jack's experience as a mediator had been tested in dozens of situations where traditional approaches to dispute resolution had failed, and his success rate in achieving lasting solutions had established him as one of the most effective peacemakers. In the Southwest, the challenges they faced were not trivial or easily dismissed. Prejudice and misunderstanding remained powerful forces in the broader society, and some of their neighbors viewed their multicultural experiment with suspicion or hostility. Occasional incidents required careful handling to prevent escalation into serious conflicts, and the constant work of maintaining harmony between different groups demanded vigilance and patience from community leaders. The death of Father Santos in the winter of 1887 had been a significant loss for the community, not only because of his personal kindness and wisdom, but because of his role as a spiritual leader who helped different religious traditions find common ground. His replacement, a younger priest who was less comfortable with the theological flexibility that had characterized Santos's approach, required careful management to prevent religious divisions from undermining community. Economic pressures from larger business interests who saw Harmony Valley's success as a threat to their own operations created ongoing challenges that required constant attention and creative solutions. Some established ranchers resented the competition from community enterprises that could underprice them by operating more efficiently and treating workers more fairly. Political pressure from these interests had to be managed through careful cultivation of relationships with territorial officials who appreciated the stability and prosperity that Harmony Valley brought to the region. The arrival of the railroad in nearby Copper Ridge in 1888 brought both opportunities and threats that required careful navigation to ensure that increased connectivity with the outside world enhanced rather than undermined the community's unique character. The easier transportation of goods to distant markets created new economic opportunities, but the influx of visitors and potential settlers threatened to overwhelm the careful balance that had been achieved between different cultural groups. Jack's approach to these challenges reflected the lessons he had learned about leadership during his years of building the community. Rather than trying to solve problems through individual decision-making or the exercise of personal authority, he relied on collaborative processes that involved representatives from all affected groups and sought solutions that honored everyone's legitimate interests. This approach required more time and patience than authoritarian alternatives, but it produced results that were more durable and commanded broader support. The success of this collaborative approach was evident in the community's response to the railroad's arrival. Rather than allowing outside interests to dictate the terms of engagement with the broader economy, community members worked together to establish their own transportation and logistics company that ensured local control over how their products reached distant markets. The profits from these operations were reinvested in community infrastructure and education, creating a virtuous cycle that strengthened their ability to maintain independence while participating in regional economic development. As the 4th anniversary of the poker game approached, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey that had transformed him from a lonely drifter into the leader of a thriving community. The changes in his own character and capabilities seemed almost as remarkable as the transformation of the struggling Henderson ranch into Harmony Valley, suggesting that personal growth and community development were interconnected processes that reinforced each other. The anniversary celebration in 1889 brought together more than 300 people, including visitors from throughout the Southwest who came to observe and learn from their experiment in multicultural cooperation. The festivities lasted for a week, with different cultural groups taking turns hosting events that showcased their traditions while demonstrating how those traditions had been adapted and enhanced through interaction with other cultures. Jack's speech to the assembled crowd reflected his understanding of what they had accomplished and what challenges lay ahead. 5 years ago, he said, I thought I understood what it meant to be independent. I thought freedom meant being responsible to no one but myself, and I thought strength meant needing nothing from anyone else. I was wrong about all of those things. He paused, looking out over faces that represented the diversity of backgrounds and experiences that had come together to create something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier. What I've learned is that real independence comes from being strong enough to accept help when it's offered, wise enough to offer help when it's needed, and courageous enough to build something together that none of us could have achieved alone. Mary's hand found his as he continued, her presence providing the kind of silent support that had sustained him through every challenge they had faced together. Tonight we celebrate not just our success, but our proof that the divisions that separate people are artificial barriers that can be overcome through patience, understanding, and the recognition that our welfare is interconnected with the welfare of everyone around us. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Jack knew that the real measure of their success was not in the approval of crowds, but in the daily choices that each person made to prioritize community welfare over individual advantage. They had created something rare and precious in a world that often seemed determined to divide people into competing factions based on race, religion, culture, or economic status. As the celebration continued around them, Jack and Mary walked to the small chapel that had been built to honor the memory of Father Santos and all the other community members who had died since Harmony Valley's founding. The building incorporated architectural elements from multiple traditions, creating a space that felt sacred to people from different religious backgrounds while serving as a symbol of their commitment to finding unity within diversity. The final entry in Jack's personal journal, written on the night of the anniversary celebration, captured his understanding of the transformation that had occurred in his own life and in the lives of everyone who had been part of their remarkable experiment. I came to Copper Ridge running from responsibility and commitment, convinced that a man was safer when he traveled light and loved nothing he couldn't afford to lose. I discovered instead that the things worth having are always the things you can't afford to lose, and that the people worth loving are the ones who make you want to become better than you ever thought you could be. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns as Harmony Valley settled into peaceful sleep, its inhabitants secure in the knowledge that they had built something worth protecting and proud of the example they were setting for others who dreamed of creating communities based on cooperation rather than competition. Inclusion rather than exclusion, love rather than fear. The lonely cowboy who had won 5 sisters in a poker game had become a man surrounded by family, prosperity, and purpose. His transformation complete because he had finally learned that the best way to find yourself was to lose yourself in service to something larger than personal ambition or individual survival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.